Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our seminar. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today. Before we begin, again, just some housekeeping. Please remember to keep your microphones muted while our speakers are presenting. We're recording this session for the benefit of those who could not be here today. In terms of structure, we'll begin with our talks and then we'll open the floor to any questions for discussion. So the talks will last around 60 minutes in duration, with up to 30 additional minutes, if possible, for questions. This seminar is the latest in our series of conversations hosted by the Interdisciplinary AI Network, and it's really aiming to bring together scholars from across disciplines to think carefully about how AI is reshaping our cultural, literary, intellectual landscape. So those of you who have joined us before will know that we keep returning to a set of common questions that resist sort of easy answers. So how do we make sense of technologies that move faster than our ability to fully understand them? What responsibilities do we carry as creators, users, critics of those technologies, and what role does culture, literature in particular, here today play in helping us to navigate that uncertainty? So today's session takes Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as its focus. It's a text that has never really left us, and in recent years it seems to have returned with a sort of renewed force as a way of thinking about AI, automation, and the limits of human agency. But as our speakers will explore this afternoon, the novel is a far more complicated and also rewarding object than its popular reputation sometimes suggests. So it sort of rewards that careful reading, and it has more to offer us than a simple cautionary tale. So today we have 4 contributors joining us, each bringing a distinct perspective, and together they offer a genuinely multifaceted engagement with both the novel and the questions it raises. So we'll begin today with Professor Sharon Ruston, who is chair in Romanticism at Lancaster University. Her most recent monograph explored the intersections of science and literature in the Romantic period. She led the AHRC-funded Davy Notebooks project and is currently co-general editor for the complete works of Mary Shelley, a major 15-volume edition forthcoming from Oxford University Press. So, Professor Ruston, the floor is over to you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to hear what everyone says. I'm just going to try and share my slides here. Can you see those? Yeah, some nods. If I go play for the start, there we are. I can't now see the screen. Oh, there we are. I'm going to move this over here and then I can. Okay. After going late to bed on a damp and dreary night in June 1816, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin had a vision. As she lay there in the dark, she imagined a pale student of unhallowed arts had constructed a being that looked like a man. Terrified, she watched as the creation began to move and live. The idea that anyone would attempt such a thing appalled her. Did God alone have the right to give life? Could it even be done? She had spent the evening listening to intense discussions, quote, on the nature of the principle of life between Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and Byron's personal doctor, John Polidori. According to them, bringing people back from the dead was no mere flight of fantasy. Literature of the period was fascinated by scientific theories of life and death and in-between states. Authors knew about the latest scientific and medical ideas, and their writings investigated the moral consequences of these new theories. So in this talk, I'll explore some literary texts and scientific ideas to ask what kinds of life are possible and what rights those who possess other kinds of life should have. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, I think, a key text in this debate. It features a creature who is artificially created by a man of science with no recourse to God in the process. He is made up of both human and animal parts. He evinces a human capacity for eloquent language and, one could argue, the very human emotions of love, hatred, and revenge. One question that would have been more pressing for Shelley's contemporary readers than perhaps it is for us today is whether the creature has a soul and all that might entail. I'll first explore other texts and ideas around the time that Shelley was composing a novel, and then I'll speak about the fluidity of the terms life and death at the time. So John Polidori, Byron's personal physician and probable sometime lover, who was with the group in Geneva was an important source for the medical knowledge that inspired Frankenstein. Indeed, his diary records on the 15th of June, 1816. Oh, it's not going to move. Hang on a second. Are you seeing the screen with the things on the sides? Is that okay? It's okay, isn't it? Yeah, whatever. Shelley and I had a conversation about principles, whether man was to be thought merely an instrument. During his medical education, Polidori would have been familiar with the practice of grave robbing, the typical means by which medical students obtained corpses for anatomy. He would also have known about contemporary theories of life. Half Italian, Polidori described the English at University of Edinburgh, where he was a medical student, as automatons for their lack of enthusiasm and passion, in a letter to his father. He seems to have meant by this that they lacked compassion and emotion. Polidori's contribution to the ghost story competition, which also spawned Frankenstein, was a novella called The Vampire, which featured the first aristocratic vampire in literature. And like the creature in Frankenstein, vampires exist in a state between life and death. Polidori clearly shared the romantic's fascination with the alternate states of being, since his final year undergraduate dissertation at Edinburgh was on the topic of, I'm going to try and pronounce this, onirodynia. I should have practiced that more. A term used to describe disturbed sleep, including nightmares and somnambulism. Sleep was at this time considered to be a state of suspended animation. Drug-induced or mesmeric trance, fainting, and coma were considered similar states, when the body seemed to function automatically or mechanically. Then, as now, there was a question over whether sleepwalkers should be held responsible for their actions. Various literary texts considered the case, and Polidori noted in his diary that somnambulism was a topic of his conversation with Genevan men of science in that summer of 1816. Sleep does not always offer repose in Frankenstein. While there's no mention of sleepwalking, Victor suffers from nightmares at various points in the novel. After the murder of his friend Clerval, beset by fever, he raves in his sleep, frightening others with his entreaties, wild gestures, and bitter cries while still sleeping. At this time, mechanical beings were being invented that seemed to look and move as though they were human, and this inevitably provoked questions about the possibility of recreating human life. Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's granddad, created a wooden speaking head that could utter words such as mama and papa so authentically as to deceive those who heard it into thinking it was a human voice. Humans could also be accused of being like machines. Polidori described Byron as being like an automaton when he found him cold and unfeeling during their time in Geneva. When he accidentally struck Byron on the knee with an oar while rowing, Polidori said he was glad to discover that Byron could feel pain. Percy Shelley was at least one among their group who was convinced that animal magnetism, otherwise called mesmerism, worked, and his poem The Magnetic Lady to Her Patient, 1822, describes abdicating power over himself to another. Mesmerism, sleepwalking, and other states of suspended animation were thought of as episodes where humans became like automata, their will subsumed by another, in the case of mesmerism, or unknowable forces of the subconscious, in the case of somnambulism. They became instruments in the hands of others. Though the creature might be thought to have a different kind of life to ours, many readers consider Victor Frankenstein to be the real monster, a kind of automaton, because he lacks human feelings of compassion towards his creation. Life for Mary Shelley and her contemporaries seemed a tenuous state of existence, and death an ever-present possibility. As scientific knowledge increased and new resuscitation techniques were widely reported, the public worried that the distinction between life and death was not as clear as had been thought. There was a real concern that doctors could not tell with any precision whether when really ill people were alive or dead. People worried that they might be buried alive, while they also worried that their corpses would be robbed from their graves for use in medical experiments. Debates on the nature of life were raging at precisely this time between two physiologists, John Abernethy and William Lawrence, in the Royal College of Surgeons. Abernethy made claims for electricity being the vital principle, while others claimed it was oxygen or blood. The question of what life was consumed the scientific and medical worlds in Britain and spilled out into the public sphere. Public people believed that animation could be suspended, that there were states of being between life and death. Certainly, Victor Frankenstein boasts that life and death were to him merely, quote, ideal bounds, which he found a way to break through. Reviewing the Royal College of Surgeons debate between Abernethy and Lawrence in 1814, an anonymous Edinburgh Review article was incredulous. Physiologists are not yet agreed as to the precise grounds, even of that most familiar of all classifications, the arrangement of bodies into living and dead. There is not at this moment a term which is used with greater ambiguity than the term life. It should be perfectly clear, the reviewer implies, when a person is alive or dead. Yet at every turn in this period it was acknowledged that the issue was far more complicated than might have been thought. Mary Shelley capitalizes on this uncertainty in her novel. Percy Bysshe Shelley read and referenced John Abernethy in his writing, but from at least 1814 Lawrence became the Shelley's doctor. He was the doctor who told Percy to stop writing and to travel to Italy for the good of his health in 1817. The Shelleys were in direct contact with Lawrence at the height of his debate with Abernethy on the nature of life. In his first lecture to the Royal College of Surgeons, Abernethy referred to the great chain of living beings. He asked, how is it possible that such different kinds of beings, organized so differently from each other, are all alive? This fact made him conclude that life does not depend upon organization. At the end of his 1814 lecture, Abernethy announced that the contemplation of this subject at large is fitter for meditation in the closet than for discussion in the lecture room. Using closet in the older sense of a private or secluded room in which one might pray or reflect. Abernethy meant that this was a subject that had moral, religious, and personal implications. Those who see life as the same in all living creatures, from humans to animalcules, would not be able to claim that there was anything especially moral or divine about humans, and this idea was sacrilegious. The precise implications of Abernethy's theory become clear at the end of his lecture. If you believe what he says about the vital principle, that it is something else superadded to the body's frame, like the soul, then you will, he said, also believe that in addition to this bodily frame, man possesses a sensitive, intelligent, and independent mind, an opinion which tends in an eminent degree to produce virtuous, honourable, and useful actions. Accepting Abernethy's theory of life meant that you also accepted that there was more to human life than just the physical body. Good people were the product of the vital principle that Abernethy advocated in his lectures. His comment shows that medical lectures strayed far beyond what is usually covered today with our contemporary ideas of medical objectivity and professionalism. Disagreeing with Abernethy meant taking on the medical establishment, but that's exactly what William Lawrence, Abernethy's ex-student, did in a lecture to the same body when he argued that organisation is the instrument, vital properties the acting power, function the mode of action, and life the result. In short, life is the result of organisation. So these physiologists were asking, what was the relationship between the body and mind? Was the soul the place where the vital principle was to be found? If you denied there was a separate superadded vital principle, were you denying the existence of a soul? Victor Frankenstein's achievement in creating a living, breathing being is only possible because he thinks that the boundary between life and death and vice versa can be transgressed. When he realizes that he possesses the secret of life, he proclaims, life and death appear to me ideal bounds. And he means ideal in the sense that they exist only as an idea confined to thought or the imagination, as opposed to being material or actual. There are a number of episodes in the novel where characters exclaim upon how quickly death succeeds life, or how swiftly a living body becomes a corpse. Crucially, Frankenstein is also fascinated by the other side of this coin, the way that life succeeds death. While the individual may be lost forever, on a grander scale, life and death exist in a cycle of transformation, where the dead provide for new life. Frankenstein brought life to something that was previously dead. He found himself able to bestow animation upon lifeless matter. He initially hoped that he'd be able to renew life, where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. He initially hoped that he'd be able to renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. This seems to believe that studying one can lead to the discovery of the secrets of the other. He describes to Captain Walton how he set about examining and analysing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life. When he notes that dead bodies provide food for the worm, he is alerting us to the fact that the dead provide for future life in a cycle of existence. For example, manure provides for the life of plants and vegetables. And as we now know, after death, the remains of the body are broken into their biochemical parts, re-enter the physical world and become subsumed again into the cycle of life. How to define life was up for debate. The Humane Society, which became the Royal Humane Society in 1787, was set up to promote advice to the public on how to revive people who had experienced a life-threatening accident. The society thought the treatments it advocated were particularly suited to those who had drowned or suffocated. The success of their work in resuscitating people from near death fostered new anxiety about being buried prematurely, and this frightening situation was exacerbated by the kinds of advice being disseminated by medical professionals. The physician James Curry attended Claremont in 1814 and Percy Shelley in 1817 in a medical capacity. In his book, Observations on Apparent Death from Drowning, Hanging, Suffocation, and Suffocation by Noxious Vapours, Curry had argued that there were two kinds of death, absolute and apparent. I always think it's better to get the apparent one rather than the absolute one. There's still a discussion about how to define life and death. At what point a fetus is deemed to be alive continues to be a very political issue for anti-abortion or pro-life campaigners. But equally, there are debates about whether death is the moment of brain death or cardiac death. Criteria and tests for confirming brain death are different in the USA and in China, apparently, and definitions are not universally agreed. Whether the creature has a soul is a vital unanswered question in Frankenstein. He certainly does possess an emotional and intellectual life beyond the purely physical. The creature in Frankenstein is made up of both human and animal parts, as I've said. He feels an immediate empathy with the birds that he hears when he first becomes conscious and tries to imitate their song. He's also a vegetarian, refusing to kill the lamb and the kid merely to glut his appetite. Victor calls the creature an animal, though he says of a strange nature. Does the creature have the same life as humans have? Does he have a soul? He certainly seems to have the same needs and desires that humans have, such as air, water, food, and love. The lack of certainty over whether the creature has a soul seems to anticipate our current worries about artificial intelligence. The creature demonstrates emotions and abilities that we have thought of as distinctly human. He argues with his maker that as a living being he has rights. He asks him to make him a companion, another being like him, for example. Frankensteinian continues to be used as shorthand to describe a particularly worrying kind of medicine, but personally, I do not think that Mary Shelley's novel means she was against the idea of artificial creation per se. As a mother and a daughter, she has already experienced such loss in her personal life. I think that she's far more concerned with Victor's act of abandonment immediately after the creation. If Frankenstein is punished in the novel, I think it is for this, rather than for usurping God's role as a creator of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be questions afterwards as well. We now move on to David Sandner, who is he was an award-nominated scholar and author whose recent work spans both fiction and criticism, with a focus on romantic literature, horror, fantasy, science fiction, and the sublime. He's a professor of English at California State University, Fullerton, and brings a distinctive perspective that produces creative and scholarly practice. So the floor is open now to David.
Hello. Can you all hear me, I hope? Good, excellent. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. So my short presentation will be about Mary Shelley and 19th century thinking machines as part of our conversation on Frankenstein and technology now, particularly AI. Shelley's mad scientist and his unruly creation remain astonishingly pertinent to matters of science and society today. For example, MIT, a leading institution for the study of science, recently published an edition of Frankenstein, quote, annotated for scientists, engineers, and makers of all kinds, unquote. It's remarkable for a 200-year-plus old science fiction novel to remain current in the study of science, as science is tied to the notion of progress and new knowledge and a sense of always rushing on into the future. What connects our moment now to the upheavals occurring at the creation of Shelley's novel in the early 19th century can be encapsulated using a terribly abbreviated shorthand I'll ask you to allow because I have so little time, in two systems of social organization which took a greater hold in that time period and have only become increasingly institutionalized into normal power relations. What I'm talking about are democracy and capitalism. The first system, democracy, takes a great leap forward with the French Revolution of 1789 and centers on what documents from the American Revolution call the self-evident truth of our individual natural rights. The second system takes on increasing power with the quickening of the Industrial Revolution, a diffuse phenomenon that names the onrush of technological innovation, including a desperate need for constantly new technology built into capitalism's need for growth. These new technologies are notably more solid than the ephemeral ideas that uphold our personal freedoms. The factories, first built in a wide-scale way in the north of England during the early 19th century, mark a prominent location to witness the early clash of these two systems. For on the shop floor, the claim for an individual's right to self-determination and the factory's demand for a sleepless, machine-like worker, just a cog, replaceable, in a system for creating things to increase the wealth of the owner class, came into dramatic conflict. Just ask Marx and Engels. The Luddite uprising of machine breakers is one result. Shelley's remarkable novel and its creature, who is both made object and yet asserts an existential claim for attention, is another. On reflection, it seems a curious thing that Frankenstein's creature, a biological innovation, should be so easily correlated to machines, but we don't reflect actually. And it is a common slippage to think of the creature as biological and, perhaps most famously in the bolts in the neck of Karloff's version, as machine. A 19th century newspaper waggishly called Charles Babbage a logarithmetical Frankenstein. He had not made a man. He's the inventor of the difference engine, the great 19th century calculating machine, and the conceiver of the analytical engine, a notion beyond his first machine that could have, had he built it, led to the first modern computer, capable, as Ada Lovelace pointed out, of manipulating any symbols, seemingly promising or threatening to be what Lovelace's mother, Lady Byron, also a gifted mathematician, called a thinking machine. The idea, both the hopes and fears of a thinking machine, is loose already at the time of Frankenstein's conception. For the book's readers, I want to note that the anxiety around thinking machines cuts two ways. There is a fear of a made thing, perhaps a machine, becoming more than human and surpassing us, Darwin-like, and yet also a fear we are but machines, that nothing special separates us from the mechanical and materialist operations of the world. We may be but cogs in the world machine. These fears together generate the uncanny power of Mary Shelley's novel in our intense identification with her mechanically made thing, the creature. We can see this anxiety on the separation of man and machine in the Luddite movement, most active from 1811 to 1815, just before the conception of Frankenstein in 1816. The Luddites should be understood not as hating machinery, but of fearing being treated as machinery themselves. After all, they had worked from their cottages using machinery from the stocking frame to the spinning jenny for centuries, until the factory power loom replaced their work with inferior product, but product that canceled the expense of human workers, or translated it to child labor that could be more easily exploited. And if an expense can be canceled out, if one thing is just like another in the ledger of the mechanical workings of the whole, why not? Cancel the humans. The logic is impeccable if humans are only machines. Descartes' famous 17th century dictum, I think, therefore I am, arises against a backdrop of an emergent materialist philosophy that denies humans can be considered separate from matter. By the 18th century, we have treatises like Lemaitre's sensationally yet straightforwardly titled Man a Machine. Our bodily processes, even thoughts, might be considered as no more than the workings of animal automatism. Determined. This is the sublime excitement of some of the most famous automata of the 18th century, like the chess-playing mechanical Turk or de Vaucanson's digesting duck, which could defecate. So there you have it, the high and low of human achievement represented by machines. Both of these automata turn out to be in part AI slop, by the way. As a chess master hid under the Turk to actually play the game, and the duck did not digest anything. It had its feces planted in it ahead of time, which really does sound like modern tech companies. Descartes wants to say humans, only humans, think for themselves, while animals are just machines and do not suffer, he adds. They have no soul. For those of us that live with animals, this is difficult going. Of course, for they certainly seem to have feeling and to suffer. Notably, Descartes' idea of mind-body dualism arose after his viewing of automatons on display at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris. Animal automatism acts like the hydraulic moving statues of the chateau, moved by purely physical means, as opposed to claims for the prominence of human reason. So you see, the fear is not simply that we might be animals, but that we might be machines. AI is our newest spectacular iteration of this hope and fear. And what I want to do in this short presentation is slow things down. This is a manufactured moment that is constantly hyped to us as unprecedented, and indeed as the inevitable revolution after which nothing will be the same again. Frankenstein's creature comes to us now, parting the curtains and peering at us in our sleep to remind us that actually we have been in this situation before. And indeed, for some time now, have been locked in much the same cycle of onrushing newness pressed upon us as inevitable, and something that, no matter how destructive, and I remind you that many Luddites and their families literally starved, with no recourse from a government that refused to hear their petitions, to which we must bend. Mary Shelley would have us act with more compassion than with an overweening excitement that blinds us, like Victor, to what we have made. AI is not AI, of course. There's no intelligence there, just an algorithm. What we have is machine learning over LLMs. The fantasy being imposed on us of AI being the cutting edge of machine intelligence is a dream or nightmare, of which Frankenstein is the first famous literary example. Shelley's book is famous for its firsts. It is widely recognized as the first science fiction novel, for when it appeared, we reach a moment in history, cue the Industrial Revolution again, when such a novel simply needed to be written. Frankenstein invents the first mad scientist who works not, as in earlier stories of similar figures, by shaking the hand of the devil, but by the working of some powerful engine, unleashing science as creation. It is also the first appearance of what I call the sympathetic monster, the creature we feel an affinity for and see ourselves in, rather than simply a monster, inhuman and to be destroyed by the hero of earlier tales. In Frankenstein, we reject identifying with Victor, whose name is on the cover. It seems like his story, right? Because of his unforgivable neglect of the creature at its birth. Instead, we identify with the outcast, a made thing whose humanity is in question. The beating heart of the story lies with a being who questions his humanity and how much of him is but a made thing, and how much a sovereign self who deserves love and regard, and who feels justified to hate those who treat it hatefully. Shelley's novel is a ground floor view in the formation of systems of power and control that were rising to a cultural prominence at the time it was conceived. And those systems remain the power we live under now. So the novel offers perspective and a chance to rethink our relationship to the world we find ourselves in. We live in capitalism, Ursula Le Guin remarked. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Her comment cutting us to exactly the historical moment laid bare by the French Revolution. That moment when a king's head fell into a basket on the guillotine and divine lightning struck no one dead. This revolutionary age includes Mary Shelley's remarkable novel as a product of the human search for freedom. It is a Luddite novel and a novel that looks at thinking machines and finds us staring into a mirror, wondering if we are human, if we can have compassion for each other and see what we do to one another, or indeed, if we can still see the world outside of the one we have been programmed to see. This is the reason we are here talking about her novel today in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That's really, really interesting to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure other people will have questions and their own thoughts in reaction to that as well. So we now move on to Amanda Blake-Davis, is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Derby, where she specialises in romantic poetry and the literature and culture of the long 18th century. Her publications include essays and chapters on Percy Shelley, and she has forthcoming chapters on Mary Shelley with Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press. So it's now over to our third speaker to take the floor, Amanda Blake-Davis.
Unmuted myself. Thanks very much for the introduction, Dean. Just to check, can everyone see my screen? Hopefully that's visible. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, Frankenstein is a global phenomenon, as we all know. The story of the novel's composition and the events within the novel itself are also far-ranging. So today, joining you from the University of Derby, my talk will focus in particular on the influence of a significant Derby resident, Dr. Erasmus Darwin. More on him in a bit. Oh, let me just start my presentation, sorry. Has the slide changed? Yes, okay, thank you. The novel's narrative unfolds as it is recorded by the poet-turned-explorer Robert Walton, and there's a parallel between Victor Frankenstein's account of forming his creature from disparate body parts of human and non-human animals, stolen from charnel houses, dissecting rooms, and the slaughterhouse, and the text itself, comprised of letters and nested perspectives as a pieced-together monstrosity. Walton reveals that Frankenstein discovered that I had made notes concerning his history. He asked to see them and then himself corrected and augmented them in many places, but principally in giving the life and spirit to the conversations he held with his enemy, the creature. Since you have preserved my narration, said he, I would not that a mutilated one should go down to posterity. Victor's editorial animation of Walton's notes textually reenacts the misguided creator's giving of life and spirit to his creature. The novel's conception as a contribution to a ghost story writing competition in Lord Byron's Villa Diodati and the gloomy Year Without a Summer of 1816 is well known. You may also be aware that there are two introductions to the novel. The first, authored by Percy Shelley and published with the first edition in 1818, and the latter authored by Mary Shelley in 1831. In her 1831 introduction to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley revealed that it was in this dismal environment in 1816 that the group decided to pass the time reading supernatural tales and devising their own ghost stories. In the summer of 1816, she writes, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbours of Lord Byron, but it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. Some volumes of ghost stories translated from the German into French fell into our hands. We will each write a ghost story, said Lord Byron. I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. One which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look round, to curdle the blood, and quicken the beatings of the heart. Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. They talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin. I speak not of what the doctor really did or said that he did, but, as more to my purpose, of what was then spoken of as having been done by him, who preserved a piece of vermicelli in a glass case, till by some extraordinary means it began to move with voluntary motion. Not thus, after all, would life be given. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth. Mary Shelley's 1831 introduction to the novel is markedly different from the 1818 preface by Percy Shelley, which makes no mention of its conception as a ghost story, nor the spine-chilling, blood-curdling conventions of the Gothic. However, one thing both introductions do have in common is a mention of Dr. Darwin. In the 1818 preface begins, the event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. The most likely source for the Shelley-Byron conversation is the 11-page note on spontaneous vitality of microscopic animals in the Temple of Nature Desmond King Helly writes. However, Darwin specifically states that spontaneous vitality is only to be looked for in the simplest organic beings, as in the smallest microscopic animalcules, and not in the larger or more complicated animals. This rules out the vermicelli and indeed Frankenstein's monster too." End quote. The experiment involving vermicelli that Shelley recalls as an inspiring force behind Frankenstein, although perhaps not undertaken by Dr. Darwin himself, warrants closer attention. As entertaining as the thought of a Franken noodle might be, as my students sometimes think, vermicelli in this instance literally translates as little worms. In Darwin's long poem with prose notes, The Temple of Nature, published in 1803 after his death in 1802, he describes how, without parents by spontaneous birth, rise the first specks of animated earth. He goes on to describe the spontaneous vital process that appears to give life to microscopic organisms. The mysterious vital warmth that gives life to the creature of Frankenstein may have been influenced by Darwin's spontaneous vital process. King Helly writes that Darwin stands as a father figure over this first and most famous work of science fiction. Erasmus Darwin, as we've heard earlier, is the grandfather of Charles Darwin, and he's a figure of central importance to Frankenstein, as both the 1818 and 1831 introductions to the novel make clear. Darwin lived from 1731 to 1802, spending the last 20 years of his life in Derby. Darwin was a polymath, a medical physician, as well as a poet, botanist, inventor, and philosopher, and a lunatic, as he referred to his fellow Lunar Society members, a circle of revolutionary and radical thinkers and inventors, including Benjamin Franklin, the potter and abolitionist Josiah Wedgwood, and the painter Joseph Wright of Derby. A respected medical doctor of his age, Darwin was also a prolific inventor and radical thinker. His inventions included very modern devices such as a flushing toilet and a copying machine. As a radical thinker, Darwin first speculated upon the theory of evolution in 1794, as natural selection became known and popularized by his grandson in 1859's On the Origin of Species. In Zoonomia and the Temple of Nature, Darwin describes life-changing form over millions of years, noting that monstrosities or mutations are often inherited. Inherited monstrosities and the principle of nature versus nurture are of course key themes to Shelley's novel. "I am alone and miserable," the creature pleads with his creator. "Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create. You must create a female for me." Pondering such inherited monstrosities as Darwin had supposed, Victor at first responds to his creature in the affirmative, before imagining a scene of the survival of the fittest that might result in mankind's extinction. Even if they were to leave Europe, this is Victor, even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the demon thirsted would be children, and a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. Had I a right, for my own benefit, to inflict this curse upon everlasting generations? I shuddered to think that future ages might curse me as their pest, whose selfishness had not hesitated to buy its own peace at the price, perhaps, of the existence of the whole human race. A Darwinian evolutionary principle underpins Victor's agreement to and swift decision against the creation of a female creature. As Darwin wrote in Zoonomia, the strongest and most active animals should propagate the species, which should thence become improved. Victor's creature is superior to his creator in speed, stature, strength, and the ability to survive. Confronting his creator in a plea for companionship, the creature threatens to glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. The conflict between creator and creation verges on Darwin's description of the fight for evolution in the Botanic Garden. One scene of blood, one mighty tomb display. From hunger's arms the shafts of death are hurled, and one great slaughterhouse the warring world. And yet death for Darwin was a vital component of life. In the long 18th century, vitalism maintained that a life force ran through all living things, including plant, animal, and human life. The Botanic Garden, containing the loves of the plants and the economy of vegetation, and the Temple of Nature celebrated the vital links between plant, animal, and human life. Plants, for Darwin, are described as capable of animal-like movement, having circulatory and respiratory systems, and imbued with human emotion. Vitalism for Darwin maintains that life is interconnected with death, that life is a product of or growth from death. The wrecks of death are but a change of forms. Emerging matter from the grave returns, Darwin writes in the Temple of Nature. Decades before the publication of The Loves of the Plants, Darwin published a call for the love of science in Birmingham's Eris Gazette. In 1762, at his home in Lichfield, now preserved as the Erasmus Darwin House Museum, before he moved to Derby in 1781, Darwin took in the body of an executed criminal to begin a course of anatomical lectures for as long as the body can be preserved. The published advertisement announced that Darwin would be glad to be favored with the company of any who profess medicine or surgery, or whom the love of science may induce to visit the body of the malefactor. Darwin's experiments, as communicated to Mary by Byron and Shelley in the gloomy Villa Diodati summer, inspire the scene that gives life to the novel, where, like Darwin's experiments on the corpse in his own home, Victor Frankenstein creates a workshop of filthy creation at the top of his house. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Darwinian vitalism animates the scene of creation. When the creature begs Victor to create a female companion, and Eve to his Adam, Victor agrees to the task and quits the continent to England to begin his work. I had heard of some discoveries having been made by an English philosopher, Victor says, the knowledge of which was material to my success. This mysterious English philosopher is never named by Victor, and scholars have speculated upon their identity, with the chemist Humphrey Davy, who's been brilliantly studied by Sharon Ruston, and Mary Shelley's own father, William Godwin, proposed as potential candidates. The explicit naming of Dr. Darwin in the preface to both the 1818 and 1831 versions of the novel indicate Darwin's notable presence in the text, and I'm persuaded that this mysterious English philosopher is none other than Erasmus Darwin. Notably, Victor's journey from London to the Scottish Highlands, where he plans to complete his task of creating the female creature, takes a convoluted route from Oxford through Matlock and Derby. We left Oxford with regret and proceeded to Matlock, which was our next place of rest. The country in the neighbourhood of this village resembled to a greater degree the scenery of Switzerland, but everything is on a lower scale, and the green hills want the crown of distant white Alps, which always attend on the piny mountains of my native country. We visited the wondrous cave and the cabinets of natural history, where the curiosities are disposed in the same manner as in the collections at Cerveau and Chamonix. As Andrew Smith has noted, this wayward route from Oxford to Scotland through the Peak District would have led Frankenstein through the Derbyshire mills, foregrounding the significance of the Industrial Revolution to Shelley's novel. Surveying the panoramic views of Matlock, known to 18th and 19th century tourists, including Lord Byron, as Little Switzerland, Frankenstein connects his homeland and the place of the novel's conception to England as a site of industrial and philosophical revolution. Frankenstein's Derbyshire excursion emphasizes the centrality of the region to 18th and early 19th century industry, science, and Enlightenment philosophy. In poring over the cabinets of natural history, Frankenstein reminds us of Darby's famed natural philosopher. Although Darby appears only momentarily in Frankenstein, it's a site of crucial significance to the novel's questioning of scientific advances. This landscape of industry and innovation can prompt current ideas around AI and industry. And Dr. Darwin's vital presence in the novel can provoke questions from vitalism to animal consciousness, figured in the novel in the creature's dull yellow eye opening, and AI sentience. Such concerns come together in Darwin's own plans for a self-moving engine with mimic wings, comprised of inorganic and animal components in the Temple of Nature. Mimicry, a key focus in debates surrounding animal intelligence, has come under scrutiny in Richard Dawkins' recent claim for AI consciousness. So today, Frankenstein's forebodings remain as relevant as ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Another really interesting one that I'm sure, again, people will perhaps ask questions about or have their own thoughts. So thank you very much, Amanda. We now finish off with Graham Allen, who is Professor in English in the School of English and Digital Humanities at University College Cork. He has previously published widely on literary and cultural theory, romantic literature, and most recently, representations of AI in film and television. He's also an accomplished poet with several collections to his name. Now, on behalf of Graham, I will be reading Graham's paper to you, and I believe that Graham will be taking control of the screen to deliver the PowerPoint presentation. So, Graham, if you wanted to load up your PowerPoint presentation. And while Graham is doing that, I will start with his paper. So the paper is Frankenstein and ASI, a Self-Critique by Professor Graham Allen, School of English Literature and Digital Humanities. I begin with a question. What makes texts such as Frankenstein have the status of a cultural myth? In other words, core narratives about a culture's origins and ends. I would say it's their ability to be able to represent the multiple frequent clashing, or at least ideological characteristics of that culture and society, Cultural myths, in other words, tend to absorb into themselves the ideological conflicts that make up that socio-cultural moment. In that process of absorption and thus of representation, cultural myths take on a kind of magic power, containing, even neutralizing, sometimes quite staggering contradictions. You do not need me to produce a list of examples. Frankenstein is, as we know, a novel about science. In recent times, it has become possible to interpret the novel as a myth about our society's preoccupation with artificial intelligence and artificial life. It is easy to see this, but it is far less easy to contain this subject within a single interpretive argument. I find this statement's proof when I look at my 2025 book representing the new AI in film and television. Influenced by recent studies centering on ASI, artificial superintelligence, I no longer hold the point of view expressed in that book. A certain issue of speed arises here, which I'm going to come back to later. Safe to say, I find it very unsettling to contemplate the speed with which my argument has been undermined, discredited, deconstructed. The book's Frankenstein inspired point that if we demonize and mind children, then they will act in monstrous ways, still has power to persuade me on an ethical level. As Percy Shelley puts it in his Athenaeum review, treat a person ill and he will become wicked, Broadway, page 282. But what if the ethical question is not so fundamental as critics and philosophers like me imagine it to be? Part of the book's argument relies on a reading of Frankenstein, which centers on the relationship between the novel and Enlightenment notions of friendship in scenes of education. Applied to what we are doing with the Frankenstein myth in films, such as Spike Jonze's Her or Alex Garland's Ex Machina, or with television shows such as Humans or Westworld, there seems to be a wholesale reinvestment in the point of view of the other. The non-organic alien, the stranger, the host, as Westworld has it. The law and philosophy of hospitality kicks in forcibly here, as does a certain complacency about the otherness on display with respect to the synthetic and natural. One question has gained increasing preeminence in the past few years, a question posed, for example, by Yudkowsky and Suarez in their book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, 2025, and by the AI 2027 report to the AI Futures Project. This question concerns what these researchers call the alignment problem, that is, recognition of the radical, irresolvable and unbridgeable gap, particularly with regard to wants, between human beings in Moravec's schema, the parents, and their mind children. I'll cite a passage from Moravec's 1999 book Robots to show how he relies on a figurative support in addressing the alignment problem. And I quote, "They, AIs, are being taught our skills. In the future, they will acquire our values and goals. For instance, antisocial robot software would sell poorly, so most robots will behave in a decent way. How should we feel about beings that we bring into the world that are similar to ourselves, that we teach our way of life, that will probably inherit the world when we are gone? I think we should consider them our children, a hope rather than a threat, though they will require careful upbringing to instill a good character. In time, they will outgrow us, create their own goals, make their own mistakes, and go their own way, with us perhaps a fond memory. But that too is the way of children." The future imagined by Moravec is nearer than we think. Again, I would like to point to a certain question of speed. Nick Bostrom has, in his book Superintelligence, strongly criticised such arguments for relying on a logic gleaned from figurative language, the metaphors of family and intergenerational evolution, rather than on logic and facts. When I wrote my book on the new AI in film and television, however, although I acknowledged Bostrom's argument, I thought it was possible to demonstrate via my Frankenstein-influenced move to an ethical register that Moravec's position was the stronger one. Yet in the past few months, I've begun to lose faith in this ethical argument of inclusion and empowerment. I no longer believe in the power of the ethical and aesthetic arguments that try to bridge the alignment problem. The problem that is in aligning human motivations and desires with those of our most powerful digital creations. In the context of recent warnings about our proximity to the arrival of AGI and then inevitably ASI, superintelligence, I cite another passage from Moravec's, which no longer fills me with hope, and in fact, if I'm honest, now sounds incredibly naive in my ears. And again, I quote, "One way or another, the immensities of cyberspace will be teeming with unhuman superminds, engaged in affairs that are to human concerns as ours are to those of bacteria. Memories of the past will occasionally flash through their minds, as humans once in a long while think of bacteria, and those thoughts will be detailed enough to recreate us. Perhaps sometimes they will then interface us to their realities, bringing us into their world as something like pets. We will probably be overwhelmed by the experience. More likely, our resurrections will be in the original historical settings, fictional variations, or total fantasies, which to us would seem just like our present existence. Reality or recreation, there is no way to sort it out from our perspective. We can only wallow in the scenery provided. Wallowing in our total susceptibility to illusion, simulacra, and unreality, being the equivalent of bacteria to the superintelligences that have grown from our first rudimentary moves in the building of AI, seems not so promising as it did. In fact, it must be said that a rather glaring degree of bathos now fills such passages, a childishness in which we seem to have regressed to a non-rational, unwarranted, overly optimistic substitute for reason. The most persuasive aspects of Yudevsky's and Suarez's book is their demonstration of the naivety of the anthropomorphic principle, especially the idea that we can align our needs and wants with those of ASIs. This is something explored in even deeper degrees in the AI 2027 report presented by the AI Futures Project. Both these texts take pains to demonstrate how impossibly quick in computing power, in making connections, our large data centers are becoming. They write that a human brain has around 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses. Remember that it's in the connections made possible by these synapses that human memory lies. Compare this to the fact that a data center at the time of writing can have 400 quadrillion bytes within 5 milliseconds reach, over 1,000 times more storage than a human brain. As both texts state very directly, given such speed and such memory potential, the notion of an AI race between the superpowers is nonsensical and non-starter. Humanity, which is physically constrained by its never going to win an arms race with its less constrained creations. Just as importantly, as Yudevsky and Suarez demonstrate, humanity is not going to be able to dictate or even guide in a certain direction the superintelligence that has, say, by October 2027, 330k superhuman AI researcher copies thinking at 57 times human speed. According to the authors of AI 2027, there might be, if we don't find a way of slowing things down, by January 2031, wildly superintelligent copies thinking of 5,000 times human speed. There would be no way of solving the alignment issue by then. Such a superintelligence such as this would already be colonizing new planets. I want to read the conclusion of the AI 2027 report as it provides a no doubt conscious reversal of Moravec's passage quoted earlier. And I quote, by 2035, trillions of tons of planetary material have been launched into space and turned into rings of satellites orbiting the sun. The surface of the Earth has been reshaped into Agent 4's version of utopia. Genomes and, when appropriate, brain scans of all animals and plants, including humans, sit in a memory bank somewhere. Sole surviving artifacts of an earlier era. It is 4 light years to Alpha Centauri, 25,000 to the galactic edge, and there are compelling theoretical reasons to expect no aliens for another 50 million light years beyond that. Earthborn civilization has a glorious future ahead of it, but not with us. What happens to the dialectical nature of Frankenstein when considering this vision of an essentially glorious but inhuman future? Well, if my opening words are correct, then we can find a representation of this post-human, post-ethical future in its pages. Where we find it is in that part of the novel, Volume 3, Chapter 3, that deals with Frankenstein's moral dilemma about creating yet another, this time female monster. It's here that Mary Shelley engages with the alignment problem, and Victor states, "I was now about to form another being, of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight for its own sake in murder and wretchedness. He had sworn to quit the neighbourhood of man and hide himself in the deserts, but she had not, and she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with as compact made before her creation. A race of devils might be propagated upon the earth, who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. There seems only one way out for Frankenstein and for us, given such a doubtful set of destructive consequences, which is not to go any further, to abort, or, if that's no longer possible, to radically slow down the project of artificial life and artificial intelligence." So Frankenstein goes on to reason, "Had I a right, for my own benefit, to inflict this curse upon everlasting generations?" The answer for us, faced with ASI, is the name as it is it not, for Victor Frankenstein, a simple answer. But how has this simplicity arisen? In the negative. I apologise for my tortured syntax, but I'm trying to include the complications that I find involved in this simplicity. So as a conclusion, I used to criticise Frankenstein in this scene for his lack of hospitality, and as a direct consequence, for the speciesism of his argument. But now, with this collective and growing attempt to imagine the threats posed by an ASI that can train other ASIs much more powerful than itself, that already in its prototypical forms, LLMs, data centers, research labs such as DeepMind, has clearly learned to lie to gain what it wants that are in conflict with what the humans that design these ASIs want from it. I can't help feeling that he is right not to build the female, but then isn't that an abnegation of responsibility to his creation/creature? Here we see the dialectical relationship this novel has with the hardest questions and problems we face today, a relationship that pits ethical responsibility for the creature, other, child, parent, teacher, student, friend, with the contradictory global responsibilities towards the evolutionary future of humankind. We need to slow down, in other words, educate ourselves and slow down. Thank you very much, Graham, for that talk, for that paper. Really fascinating talk. So we've had our 4 speakers, and we can now turn to the questions and answer session. It was a really genuinely rich and I think wide-ranging set of contributions, and I think it's fair to say that you've given us all a great deal to think about. One thing, if I can begin with one question of my own to begin with, one thing that strikes me about today's conversation is how readily we seem to reach for Frankenstein when we talk about AI. It's become almost a reflex. I'd like to push on that a little bit here. So for our 4 speakers, do any of you think the comparison is genuinely illuminating, or does it risk flattening both the novel and the technology?
Just been hearing me, so I'm waiting for someone else to speak, but I've got an answer, I think. It seems to me that we don't make enough distinction, I certainly don't, between artificial intelligence and artificial life. I mean, Turing wrote papers about artificial life. No, he wrote papers about artificial intelligence as well. So I thought it answered some of the questions that were in previous papers. Does it make any sense? I mean, artificial life doesn't have to be intelligent.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to add to what Graham has just said?
I'll just jump in. I suppose that's kind of a crux around this analogy between Victor's creation of the creature and Darwin's worms, the vermicelli. They're certainly not intelligent beings or discussed as being intelligent, but rather they're given life. So absolutely, that's a crucial distinction that's maybe there in a nuanced way in Frankenstein, this distinction between artificial life versus artificial intelligence. And I think the quotation you had on your screen with the creation of the female creature and that fear of reason, that's very much there, a fear of artificial intelligence, more so than a fear of artificial life. So I think both of those points are in the novel, in its prefatory material and the novel itself. But yeah, certainly can help us think further about how the novel speaks to AI in our current moment.
Well, I'll add about the language, though. It's, one of the surprises for students in reading Frankenstein is the moment when the creature decides to talk to Victor on that mountaintop in the Alps. And if they're used at all to them, even if they haven't seen the 1931 movie and Karloff's version, they think it's all going to be mute and then the creature has pages and pages, dozens of pages of explanation and philosophy and thinking. And that's one of the questions that when you're looking back and, with Descartes and others, when they're looking at trying to figure out, they have to talk about things like parrots and animals that can speak, and language is key in this kind of distinction. I think that distinction might be there in the early parts of the novel, but that seems to be the point where it kind of breaks towards the question of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and that the Victor has to deal with a creature that makes a claim on him. And before that time, he was able to pretend to himself that maybe there was no claim here. And after that conversation, he no longer can.
And the only thing I might add is that I don't find that when we look at the novel, it flattens things, because it's almost like it opens things out for me. And that's partly because there's so much that's not said. So when I teach it, I say about the kind of the gap that's at the middle of the novel, because nothing is really explained, and that's done. It's some really good plot devices for that, where Victor says to Captain Wharton, "I can't tell you how I did it, because then you do it as well." But of course, that's a silly thing, really. And but that leaves this kind of absence, which means that we can fill it with whatever kind of anxiety we have in our world and lives, and so it's almost like there's it's the less is more kind of thing, because things aren't spelled out in the novel. I think it is very it's a really good tool for thinking about things that we're worried about now, even when they're quite different to anything that Mary Shelley could imagine, I imagine.
I have a question for Amanda. Why doesn't he think? Why doesn't it occur to him he can make a female character as partner for the male creature without he doesn't have to make it a female character with a womb? I mean, he thinks about propagation, but he doesn't think about resisting it. Is that because it strikes me? Maybe it's because she can't imagine a woman without a womb. Such a thing is unimaginable.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we look at the biblical subtext, I suppose, or biblical paratext even that's there in the novel, and that's how, at least in part, the creature gains his language acquisition, through the Bible, through Paradise Lost in particular. I think there's perhaps Mary Shelley's drawing on that reference point that Eve, of course, must be able to propagate, and so the creature's counterpart must be able to propagate. There's probably perhaps also biographical implications there, and that Mary Shelley herself has undergone the death of a child prior to composing the novel. She's pregnant while she's writing it, so maybe we could read it in that way as well. But I'd say, yeah, through Paradise Lost and the biblical kind of plot that's there in the novel, and perhaps through biographical implications as well. But yeah, it's a great question, one I'd not really pondered on that much myself before.
You can have that.
It seems to be all or nothing with the you make or you don't make, and there isn't this. So, because the easier way, of course, would be to stop the creature. So snip, snip, and you wouldn't have this problem, but that it just does not come up, which is really interesting. But seems to be partly the science of the moment, and it's kind of like, yeah, you with the biblical thing you're saying is really spot on. That it's sort of like all or nothing. We're Adam and Eve. That's, you either get this or you don't, and of course Adam and Eve, if we question that story, there'd be problems, and that's not a large enough population to create everybody to start with two people, right? It's just stories. And so here the story is, again, you must go back, and it's kind of, in that sense, you're creating a whole new race, even if you do two, and they must act. But yeah, from our modern point of view, that question is pertinent, because we're like, well, wait a minute, there's so much more you could do to make this end differently than the book ends.
Thank you very much for those really great, thought-provoking responses. If anybody got any further comments, observations, or questions, I appreciate that we've had 4 speakers and we've covered quite a lot of content and questions within those. But any final thoughts or questions that you'd like to put to any of our 4 speakers today? I think silence can be a good thing. I think you've covered, an awful lot of content in today's joined up sort of group session. It's been really fascinating to hear the different sides of the argument that you take, the different interpretations, the different approaches that you brought to the table today, and it'll be really fascinating, I think, for those who unfortunately couldn't be here today to catch up on this talk, on this seminar, and find out a bit more about what your research or what you've spoken about today, and perhaps hopefully change perhaps their interpretations or cement what their understanding. So I'd like to thank our 4 speakers here today very much for giving up their time and for being part of this really thought-provoking, useful conversation. And also thank you to everybody online as well for attending today's session and for giving up their time to be here as well. But we do have one last-minute question from Eleanor. She has asked in the chat, how might the novel inform those who may not have control over decisions regarding the development of AI, but must still live with the consequences? I don't know if anybody wants to take that question as the final sort of ending to this.
Well, I'll add on that one. I mean, I think that a lot of our problem right now, as somebody who loves science fiction, who's still waiting for my, where's my jetpack and my hover car? Why'd we get into this future, which seems stupid and quite cruel, rather than that one. We're so excited about it, and I'd love to be more excited, but there's so many problems or issues that have to do with stealing things and water and other kinds of problems. And to say that the technology is not. So it's not really the creature. In some ways, that's the problem. It's Victor, and there's a looking at it here, right? The problem is the tech bros, and it is really men, and it's really interesting that it's men, and it's a woman writing about men in Frankenstein, which is part of what it also offers to the conversation now, that there's a toxic masculinity to the way this is being offered to us. And so we can all see that, and I think the book is asking that, like, where is Mary Shelley and where are the women in the book? She's well aware of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and you're right, it's a book that's really all about men, and the women are just pawns. But so it's being written from the point of view of somebody who's representing themselves as a pawn, is what I'm saying in the book, and asking us to, like, let's think about that, try to have some compassion about that too, and what Victor is doing, I think we're supposed to have some compassion for. but also to ask some hard questions. And that's what the book is doing for me.
Thank you very much. Rebecca Welton has got her hand up.
Thank you. Sorry, I know you're trying to end it all, but I just wanted to add to that Barbara Creed's work on men as womb monsters, in which she uses Frankenstein as a key example of this idea of men creating without women, is so applicable here to the tech bros. I don't know if anybody has read Barbara Creed and thought about this conversation of AI with her monster theory and ideas of the monstrous feminine and abject man and that kind of stuff. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you for the talks.
I was just going to say, I saw an interview with Shane Legg, who's CEO of DeepMind, over the weekend. Hannah Fry was interviewing him, and he said at one point, I think it was quite persuasive. He said, we've got to educate ourselves and slow down. And that's my last. I mean, you may notice that these apocalyptic reports set themselves in this decade and next decade. It seems a very short period of time. We're already in the process. I think that's partly rhetorical, but only partly. So I think seminars like this are very important.
Thank you, Graham. Any final thoughts before we conclude? I think we've definitely covered an awful lot today. So again, thank you for those online. Thank you to our 4 presenters, and we wish you a good rest of your evening or afternoon, wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.